Jesus Christ.
Today's gospel, today's parable, Jesus wants to shock us. Did we hear his words? He says, "Truly I tell you, tax collectors and prostitutes are going to enter the kingdom of God ahead of you." And you and I, if we are tuning in to this Mass, I would suggest we probably consider ourselves religious people. And the scholar Father Raymond Brown once said about this gospel, if you look at it, the greatest sinners tended to not have a problem with Jesus' message. It was those, maybe like myself or yourself, that we consider ourselves religious, is we can say the prayers, know some of the teaching of the church, think we have the answers, and we have to be careful that we're not unopen to the change that the good news, the gospel, is calling us to. Think about it. The prostitutes and tax collectors were the one that were seen far from God. And yet Jesus said that they're going to get into the kingdom of God ahead of the chief priests and elders who were expected to be close to God. Oftentimes what Jesus is getting at is if we think we already have the answer, we cannot change our thinking. And the religious tendency is to can become frozen on what we think and not have the ability to move and change like God's mercy does with the prostitutes and tax collectors. Einstein once said, "Everything has changed but our thinking." The reality is the river of life is a movement. It's always flowing. But the mind tends to lag behind it. It holds on to past moments. It cannot ride the new, the good news that is happening for us and enter that kingdom message that offers such joy, liberation, and freedom. A story from the Sufis goes like this. There was a case against Mullah Nasruddin, and the court and the judge asked him, "How old are you, Nasruddin?" He said, "You know, and everybody knows. Of course, I'm 40 years old." This surprised the judge because 5 years ago, he said, "You were also in this court, and I asked you how old you were, and you said you were 40. How is this possible? After 5 years, you're still 40. Nasruddin said, "I am a consistent man, sir. Once I say I'm 40, I remain 40 forever. You can rely on me." The point of the story, loyalty to the mind is foolish. Holding tightly to my same position as I did earlier comes at a price, and I can deny the facts, the reality, the participation in the great river of life. The old adage runs true: the mind makes a good servant, but a poor master. You see, parables like Jesus tells are like jokes. They get to the punchline to shock us, maybe even make us laugh, to see reality different. You see, we have to be willing to move into change, to move into new life, and we'll starve. And we may not die, but emotionally, physically, spiritually, we can be dead if we don't move into the new life Jesus holds us. We don't have to hold on to our former reality. Jesus gives us permission to let go. We can take Jesus' call to move forward in the flow of life, to change, to enter into that newness of life. The tax collectors and prostitutes did. We have permission by that new life, like those fish, to go to the other side of the shore, to be fed. The purpose of this parable is to call us to change. Jesus addressed it to the chief priests and elders. He wants it to serve as a mirror for their consciences. So you have it. You have two servants. The first says he won't do it. He doesn't want to change, or she doesn't want to change, and then does. And the second says, I'll do it, but doesn't. One is uncomfortable with change, which are sinners and prostitutes, but they accept it. They move into that new life. And tax collectors, the elders and priests are unwilling to change. The problem with not growing and is changing is that we make ourselves God rather than disciples and followers into what's new. It's dangerous to have all the answers and not be open to what's new is being presented to us. Philippians today shows us through the hymn that this hymn is how to change, how to move towards change. What did Jesus do? He put aside his godliness. In a sense, he didn't take his godliness so seriously that he could not put it aside and enter fully into our human condition. Both our joys and our foibles. I mean, Jesus could look with prostitutes and tax collectors in not a superior way. But for the first time, he could raise their human dignity because he looked at them with equality and unconditional love. So much so that he would enter into the powerlessness of our human condition, all of our vulnerability. And what would happen? He would go to the point of the cross to be murdered by those who were determined to hold power over. Where Jesus came with the power of the Spirit to carry, so that we could be empowered to carry out a life of love. And so this humility of God is like a centrifugal force. It's a force of love, like we hear in that hymn, that moves outward, out of self, to empower and bring new life to those in all situations around us. You know, I can think of the church, I can think of the world, I can think of any profession, and the most dangerous people I have ever met take themselves too seriously. Recently, I heard a story. We all respect and love nurses and doctors and what they're doing during this pandemic. However, not all are good, like any other profession. Recently, I heard a story about two doctors that were really impressed with themselves, with their abilities. So one of the doctors nicknamed himself God, and another nicknamed himself Jesus. Well, one day, another doctor, like a parable, thought the best thing was to do was to burst their bubble. So he said to the doctor, Jesus, if you show me how to walk on water, I'll show you how to change that catheter. Humility is the message today. It is accepting our powerlessness, that we're not God, that a life of grace comes with gifts but also human limitations. Or as my friend and mentor, Father Larry Can, deceased, would say, we need to take everything serious but ourselves. We need to take the people and situations and what our professions or callings call us to. Take that seriously. But don't take ourselves too seriously. This brings me back to the gospel. You see, the chief priests and elders, Jesus has just healed a man with a withered hand. They could have said, nice hand, but they were upset he did this on the Sabbath. I think we have to remember there were good chief priests and elders in Jesus' day. But these particular ones wanted to make sure they had the power and control. And they are trying to trap Jesus, who is operating out of the best of his Jewish tradition to bring forth life. The whole context of this gospel is they ask him where his authority comes from. If he says he does it on his own authority, he will be viewed as a maverick without having legitimate formal authority by the faith tradition like the elders have. If he says he does it on God's authority, they trap him there too, because the chief priests and elders are the legitimate interpreters of what comes authentically from God. Jesus doesn't fall into the trap, but gives them one because they want to uphold their power and violently crush what they see as a threat to their power, which is Jesus. This is very relevant today in our church and country. We have to realize just because someone has formal authority does not necessarily mean that they're operating out of the authority that comes from God. A good example, chief priests and elders, is Michael Bransfield, who misused his formal authority to abuse, steal, and destroy. Not all bishops or priests are bad, but he misused his formal authority for his own selfish and violent agenda with no regard for others. Another situation from this week with Breonna Taylor tragically killed by a cop. Fired many shots at an innocent vulnerable. This cop misused his authority. Law enforcement is used to protect the common good, and there are many good cops who use their formal authority well. But this situation, I don't know about you, but I don't think the cops did. I think it was unjust and evil. What do these two examples hold in common? With Michael Bransfield and the injustice there, the people of God do not feel that we have been given the justice that is necessary for healings, and especially the victims feel that way. Then Breonna Taylor, the situation in court, the decision where the cops get off in a very minor way with few charges. We don't feel like we've been given justice, and the black community and the victims of violence, rightly so, don't feel they have been given justice. The gospel calls us to change the way we think, but also to change the structures as well. What in the church has to change to hold our formal authority and bishops and priests accountable, which I believe we have to change the structure that sometimes puts the priest above the laity. I'm a member of the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests, and one of the things that we've pushed for reform to our bishops who have not done this yet, but we said that a seminarian should not put a collar on until he's a deacon. In a sense that he had to find his internal call before he wears some formal authority. We need reforms of our seminary. We need women at each level of decision making, laity. This will bring about change. We got to catch these things earlier on than we have. Well, what about what is happening with Breonna Taylor or George Floyd? What needs to happen with law enforcement so that this does not happen? You know, I'm not an expert in this field, but a prosecutor once told me, he said, we need to start like the seminary at the academy. And do we pick up on behaviors that this might not be a good cop? Is there a racism there? I have a good friend who is a priest in Atlanta who tells me how many of his parishioners who are black, because of the car they drive that is nice, get pulled over for no reason. How do we change this behavior? We need good cops and priests. We need good leaders. You know, the definition of insanity, someone once said, is to do the same thing and expect different results. This is what Ezekiel says today. We're responsible, all of us, to do our part to make the necessary changes to fight, whether in the pews for justice or in our church or on the streets or in the courts for equality. We all have a part to play, and we have to take responsibility. Otherwise, we're insane because we're doing the same thing and expecting different results.